Hey guys, you've come to the right place. This channel is all about exciting, entertaining, and engaging videos that will keep you hooked from start to finish. If you enjoy this kind of content, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on anything new.
I grew up in a small town outside of Cleveland, the kind of place where everybody knew whose truck was in whose driveway and why. My dad was a diesel mechanic. My mom worked the register at the pharmacy on Main Street. We weren't poor exactly, but money was something you talked about at the kitchen table every Sunday night, and vacations meant driving to my uncle's cabin in Pennsylvania. When I was 9 years old, our neighbor Mr. Monia Kowalski had a heart attack shoveling snow in his driveway, and I watched two paramedics shock him back to life right there on his own sidewalk. One of them winked at me on the way back to the rig. From that day on, nothing else existed for me. I was going to save people for a living, and I was going to do it in a small town, because that's where the ambulances came. The slowest, and the patients needed you the most. My wife was the girl who sat behind me in 7th grade biology. She passed me a note that said her brother thought paramedics were just glorified taxi drivers, and she drew a little smiley face next to it. I turned around and told her I'd marry her someday just to prove him wrong. She laughed so hard, the teacher separated us. 10 years later, we got married in her parents' backyard in Akron because a church wedding cost more than my entire year of EMT school. She was tall, almost my height, with strawberry blonde hair and a crooked front tooth she refused to fix because she said it gave her character. She was already most of the way through her nursing degree by then, and we had big plans and a small apartment and a mattress on the floor. We were going to build a life the slow way, brick by brick, the way our parents had done. That was the deal. We moved to a little town called Bellers Creek, about an hour southwest of Akron, because the hospital there was hiring nurses and the fire department was hiring medics. We bought a fixer-upper 2 blocks off the main road for $92,000, a 100-year-old farmhouse with a porch that sagged and windows that rattled every time a truck went by. My wife named it the Money Pit the first night we slept there. I spent 3 years of weekends replacing the roof, the plumbing, and most of the floor joists. She sewed curtains and painted every room a different color and hung her grandmother's mirror over the fireplace. On Sunday mornings, she'd bring me coffee on the porch, and we'd talk about the garden we were going to plant when the snow finally melted. I thought that was it. I thought that was the whole movie. What nobody tells you about loving somebody since you were 12 years old is that you stop watching them. You stop reading the room. You assume the ending because you wrote the first chapter together. I should have noticed when she started taking longer shifts. I should have noticed when she came home smelling like a cologne I didn't own. I should have noticed when the gym bag she never used started disappearing on Thursday nights. I didn't notice any of it because I was working 3 jobs to cover the nursing home where my mom had been living since her Alzheimer's got bad enough that my dad couldn't handle her alone anymore. I was pulling double shifts on the ambulance, cleaning offices with my buddy Mateo on weekends, and I still barely covered the $8,000 a month the memory care unit charged. My wife knew all of that. My wife had sat with me in a social worker's office the day we admitted my mother. My wife had held my hand while my mom asked me who I was. The call came in at 11,047 on a Thursday night in late September. Unconscious female, possible overdose, room 42012 at the Riverside Inn off Route 14. My partner that night was a kid named Danny Boas, 22 years old, 6 months out of the academy, still calling me sir whenever he forgot not to. I pulled the rig into the parking lot and grabbed the bag, and we took the stairs 2 at a time because the elevator had one of those signs on it. Room 420 at the end of the hall. The door is propped open with the room phone because whoever called 911 had panicked and left it that way. I walked in with Danny behind me, and I saw a man in his 50s standing in his undershirt in the middle of the room, his hair wet, his belt undone, and on the bed, half wrapped in a sheet, was my wife. She was breathing. She was conscious. She was holding a little Ziploc bag in her hand, and her pupils were the size of dimes. I want to tell you, I was a professional. I want to tell you I checked her vitals, started a line, called for a second unit, and wrote the report clean. I did most of that. What I didn't do was say a single word to her. Danny didn't know she was my wife. The man in the undershirt didn't know I was her husband. He kept saying his name over and over like it mattered. Dr. Tain, Marcus Pelletier, chief of cardiology at Bellers Creek Regional, like his title was going to make the ambulance go away. I recognized him. I'd brought patients into his department a dozen times. He was the one who always stood a little too close to the nurses and laughed a little too loud at his own jokes. My wife looked at me from the bed and said my name. One time, quiet, and I said, "Ma'am, we're going to get you to the hospital." Tried to relax. I didn't call her anything but ma'am the entire ride. I called her mother from the ER parking lot at 3 in the morning. I told her where her daughter was and what I'd found her doing, and I told her I was going home to pack. Her mother cried. Her mother asked me not to do anything stupid. I told her I was done doing stupid things on behalf of her daughter, which was the meanest thing I'd ever said to that woman, and I regretted it before I even hung up. I drove home. I didn't pack. I sat on my porch in the dark and I looked at that mirror over the fireplace through the living room window. And then I went inside and I took it down and I wrapped it in a blanket and I put it in the trunk of my car. Then I called her mother back and told her to come get it because it belonged in her family and not in my house anymore. I didn't break it. I almost broke it. That's the only thing I want credit for. She came home 2 days later on her own 2 feet, sober, showered, wearing the same clothes she'd had in that gym bag. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a manila folder. I slid the folder across the table without looking up. She opened it. Divorce papers, already signed on my end, drawn up by a lawyer named Ruthann Cho, who I'd known since high school and who had agreed to do it for free because her brother was a medic in Columbus and she owed him a favor he'd never collect. My wife didn't cry. She asked me if we could talk. I told her we were talking. She asked me if I'd heard her side. I told her I'd seen her side, and her side had been on its back in a hotel bed at midnight with a man old enough to be her father. She told me it wasn't what I thought. I asked her what I thought. She couldn't answer that. Nobody ever can. She tried to stay in the house. That's the part that still gets me. She tried to stay in that house that I'd rebuilt from the studs out, and when I told her to pack a bag, she told me her name was on the deed too. She was right. So I packed my own bag instead, and I moved into the apartment above Mateo's garage, and I let her have the house for exactly 4 weeks while my lawyer worked out the paperwork. 4 weeks was all she needed. By the time we got to mediation, she'd emptied our joint checking account, cashed out the small retirement fund I'd started, and transferred the title of her Honda Civic to her sister's name in Akron so it couldn't be counted as marital property. She showed up to mediation with a lawyer I couldn't have afforded in 1,000 years and a face that said she was the victim. She got the house. She got 2/3 of what little savings we had left. I got my truck, my tools, and a settlement agreement so lopsided it should have been illegal. Ruthann told me we could fight it. I told Ruthann my mother had $8,000 a month coming due on the 1st, and I didn't have time to fight anything. I sold the truck for $6,000 to a kid from the fire academy. I bought a 1998 Ford Ranger for $1,500, and I put the difference toward my mom's bill. I moved out of Mateo's garage and into a studio above a hardware store on Main Street for $400 a month. I picked up every shift the department would give me, and on my days off I cleaned offices with Mateo's wife Elena, who treated me like a second son and fed me dinner 3 nights a week, whether I wanted it or not. Mateo and Elena had crossed into Texas from Reynosa in the back of a pickup truck when they were both 19, with nothing but 2 changes of clothes and a cousin's phone number. They'd raised 4 kids in a trailer park outside town, sent all of them to college, and they owned a small cleaning company now with 18 employees. They were the best people I'd ever known in my life, and for almost 3 years, they were the only people keeping me upright. My mother died in the memory care unit on a Tuesday in April, and she didn't know who I was at the funeral, which was fine because she hadn't known who I was for 2 years before that either. I was free of the $8,000 a month bill the morning after her burial, and that was the first morning in 3 years I'd woken up without a knot in my stomach. I sat in my truck in the cemetery parking lot, and I cried for 40 minutes. Not because my mother was gone, but because I couldn't remember what her voice sounded like anymore. Elena found me there. She'd followed me from the church. She got in a passenger seat, and she didn't say a word for a long time, and then she said, "My hi, Joe, you have paid enough. Now you live." She made me promise I'd start going out again. I promised. I didn't mean it. I went home and I slept for 16 hours. About a month after my mother's funeral, I responded to a multi-vehicle accident on Route 14 at about 4 in the afternoon. An older gentleman in a Lincoln Navigator had crossed the center line and hit a van head-on. The van driver was fine, shaken but fine. The Navigator was on fire, and the old man inside wasn't moving. Danny and I got him out. His femur was broken, his chest was crushed, his airway was full of blood, and he was going into cardiac arrest by the time we got him on the gurney. I worked that old man the whole way to the hospital. I did compressions until my arm shook and my partner had to take over. We got a pulse back twice. We lost it twice. We got it back a 3rd time on the table in the ER, and I walked out of that hospital 2 hours later thinking he was dead. I didn't even stay for the name. The paperwork said John Doe because he hadn't been carrying a wallet. I washed up in the bay and I drove home and I didn't think about him again for 2 years. The woman I met 6 months after my mother's funeral was a preschool teacher named Sarah, 29 years old, 4'11" in boots. I met her at the laundromat because she couldn't reach the top of the folding table, and I held her basket for her. She told me later she'd been watching me for 3 weeks and had been washing the same sheets over and over waiting for me to talk to her. She had a laugh that started in her chest and got stuck there for a second before it came out. She wore her hair in a braid down her back, and she carried picture books in her purse at all times in case she ran into one of her kids at the grocery store. On our third date, she told me she'd been engaged once to a medical resident in Columbus who'd left her 6 weeks before the wedding to marry another resident. She said she'd been saving every paycheck for 2 years so she'd never have to depend on anybody again. I told her I understood. I told her everything. I told her about the hotel room and the divorce and the truck I'd sold and my mother's voice I couldn't remember. She listened to all of it. At the end, she said, "I'm not in a hurry. You take as long as you need." Nobody had ever said anything like that to me in my whole life. Sarah moved in with me 6 months later into an apartment we'd rented together on the second floor of an old Victorian on Elm Street. She kept her own savings account. She paid half of every bill on the first of the month without fail. She cooked dinner on Mondays and Wednesdays, and I cooked on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and on weekends we did it together. She met Mateo and Elena 2 weeks in, and Elena kissed her on both cheeks and said, this one you keep." I was 38 years old, and I was happier than I'd been since I was 12, and I knew it, and I was grateful for every morning. About a year into my life with Sarah, a man I didn't recognize walked into the ambulance bay at the end of my shift and called me by name. He was in his 70s, silver hair, a cane, a black Cadillac idling out front with a driver in the seat. He stuck out his hand and said, "Son, my name is Walter Hayes. You saved my life on Route 14 2 years ago last April. I've been trying to find you for 18 months. He'd spent a year at the Cleveland Clinic recovering, another 6 months at Mayo for a heart valve, and the rest of the time hunting down every EMT who'd been on that stretch of highway that afternoon. The paperwork had been a mess because he'd been flown out before anybody got a proper name on the intake form. He said he wanted to buy me dinner. He said we had things to discuss. I told him I got off in 40 minutes. He said he'd wait. What I didn't know about Walter Hayes was that he'd sold a natural gas company to a bigger natural gas company for $240 million the year before his accident. He wasn't the richest man in Ohio, but he was on the list. He took me and Sarah to dinner at the only steakhouse in Bellers Creek that still had tablecloths, and over a glass of bourbon he told me he'd never had children. His wife had died of cancer 6 years earlier, and he'd spent the year after his accident rewriting his will. He said he'd already paid off the mortgage on the house I'd been renting above the Victorian, and the deed was in my name as of Monday. He said there was a new Ford F-250 sitting on the lot at the Ford dealer in Canton with my name on the paperwork, and he didn't want me standing at any more bus stops. He said he'd set up a trust that would pay me $100,000 a year for the rest of my life, renewable to any children I might have, on the condition that I use some of it to start a mobile rural emergency response program, because there were 3 counties out here that had 1 ambulance between them, and he'd been one of the lucky ones. He said he wanted me to run it. He said Sarah could be the community health coordinator if she wanted, at a salary he'd set himself, and he'd pay off every dime of her student loans on Monday morning. Sarah started crying into her wine. I couldn't get a word out. Walter tapped his cane on the floor and said, "Son, close your mouth. Flies will get in." I asked him about Mateo. Walter grinned. He said Mateo and Elena's cleaning company had just been awarded a 5-year contract to service every one of Walter's properties statewide, which was 42 buildings including the office building in downtown Cleveland. He'd signed it that morning. He said Elena had cried too when he called her. He said she'd prayed over the phone for 20 minutes in Spanish and he hadn't understood a word, but he'd felt every bit of it. I proposed to Sarah 2 weeks later on the porch of our house, which was now actually ours, and she said yes before I was done asking. We got married 3 months after that in Elena's backyard because Elena wouldn't have it any other way, and Walter walked Sarah down the aisle because her own father had passed the year before and she'd asked him herself. Mateo was my best man. I'd never been so happy in my whole life, and I'd never been so sure I hadn't earned any of it. Walter told me once, later, that a man doesn't earn luck. A man earns the right to be trusted with it. He said that was the only thing worth working for, and the money was just a way to keep score. I'm going to tell you the part I don't like telling now, because it has to do with my ex-wife. And I had not thought about my ex-wife in close to a year when she showed up at our front door on a Sunday afternoon in October. Sarah and I had just gotten back from the farmer's market with a bag of apples and a pumpkin for the porch, and there was a woman sitting on the top step, half turned away, leaning on a 4-pronged cane. It took me 3 full seconds to recognize her. She'd lost 30 pounds, her hair was thin and gray at the roots, and the left side of her face was slack in a way that I recognized professionally before I recognized it personally. She looked up at me and tried to smile, and only half of her mouth worked. She said my name the same quiet way she'd said it from the hotel bed. Sarah stopped at the bottom of the steps with a bag of apples. I set the pumpkin down and I asked my ex-wife what she was doing on my porch. She told me Dr. Seddon, Marcus Pelletier, had lost his license 8 months earlier after a patient died of a medication error that traced back to him covering for a younger doctor he was sleeping with. He'd lost the hospital. He'd lost the house in Shaker Heights. He'd lost the boat and the car and the bank accounts. And 3 weeks before she showed up on my porch, he'd driven his Mercedes into the Cuyahoga River at 2 in the morning with the windows up and the doors locked. My ex-wife had been in the passenger seat. He hadn't told her. She'd blacked out when the car went under, and she'd come to in a hospital bed 4 days later with the left side of her body paralyzed and the news that Marcus was dead and the creditors were coming for everything that was left. She had no savings. She had no family. She had no savings. She had no family. She hadn't already burned. Her mother had cut her off a year into the affair and never spoken to her again. Her sister had kept the Civic and changed her number. My ex-wife had been sleeping in a shelter in Akron for 3 weeks, and she'd taken a bus to Bellers Creek because she didn't know where else in the world to go. I stood on that porch and I listened to her tell me all of it, and I didn't feel any of the things I thought I was supposed to feel. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel sorry for her. I felt tired. I felt like a man who'd built a new house on the ashes of an old one and woken up to find somebody had dragged a charred beam into his new living room. I told her I couldn't help her. I told her I didn't have room in my life for her, not in any corner of it, and I didn't owe her anything, and she'd made her choices on a bed in a hotel room on Route 14 4.5 years ago. I told her to get off my porch. She started to cry. She told me she had nowhere to go. Sarah came up the steps and set the apples on the railing and took my hand and squeezed it, hard, and whispered, "Outside, not inside." And she led me down the steps and around to the side yard, and she said, "I don't want her in our house. I don't want her anywhere near our house. I don't want her anywhere near our house. But we can't let her die on the street. That's a different thing." Sarah and Elena spent the next 3 days finding my ex-wife a room. Not in our house. Not on our street. Not in our neighborhood. Elena called in a favor with a parish priest in Canton, and they found her a studio apartment in a seniors building run by the Catholic Diocese, 45 minutes away, where they took payment on a sliding scale. I paid the first 3 months out of pocket. Sarah said that was the limit, 3 months. Enough time to file for disability and get herself on state assistance. I agreed. After 3 months, she was on her own. Sarah drove her to the apartment herself in Sarah's car and helped her carry her 1 suitcase up the stairs. I didn't go. I haven't been to that apartment once in the 4 years since. I haven't seen my ex-wife's face in person since the day Sarah drove her away. Sarah visits her sometimes on her way back from the market in Canton. Elena visits her too. They tell me she goes to Mass every morning. They tell me she cleans houses when she can, for a woman who knows her situation and pays her in cash. They tell me she's dating a widower from the parish, a retired electrician with 3 grown daughters, a kind man who doesn't know anything about her past and isn't going to find out from me. Sarah asked me once late at night whether I'd ever forgive her. My ex-wife, I mean. I thought about it for a long time. I told Sarah that forgiveness wasn't something I owed anybody. I told her forgiveness was something I gave myself on my own schedule for my own reasons, and it didn't require my ex-wife to ever know about it. I said I'd stopped being angry. I said I wished her no particular harm. I said that was the most honest answer I had. Sarah said that was enough. Sarah said that was probably more than most men would manage. I told her she'd married a man who'd been raised by a mechanic and a pharmacy clerk in a small town outside Cleveland. And the only 2 things they'd ever taught me were to finish what I started and to not waste good weather holding a grudge. Sarah laughed her chest laugh. We went to sleep. Our daughter was born the following spring. We named her Margaret after my mother. Walter cried when he held her. Mateo and Elena cried when they held her. I cried a lot that whole year, for a lot of reasons, most of them good. The Rural Emergency Response Program Walter funded opened its doors 18 months after that dinner, with 4 ambulances, 12 medics, and a coordinator named Sarah Pelletier Hayes, because she'd kept her nursing certification current and finished out her community health degree at night while I rocked our daughter through 2 ear infections and a bout of croup. We named the program after Walter's late wife. He sat in the back row at the ribbon cutting and pretended he didn't know about it until we unveiled the sign, and then he hugged me for a long time and told me I was the closest thing to a son he'd ever had. He passed away 2 years after that, peacefully, in his own bed, with his old driver and his housekeeper and me and Sarah in the room. He left almost everything to a foundation he'd set up in his wife's name. He left Margaret the cabin on Lake Erie where he used to fish. He left me his cane. I keep it by the front door. I tap it on the floor sometimes when I walk in just to hear him. People ask me sometimes whether I'd have done anything different. Whether I wish I'd seen it coming. Whether I wish I'd fought harder for the house, or the money, or the years I lost taking double shifts and cleaning offices on weekends while my mother forgot who I was. I tell them no. I tell them I wouldn't change any of it. If I fought harder for the house, I wouldn't have moved above the hardware store. If I hadn't moved above the hardware store, I wouldn't have been doing laundry on Elm Street the day a 4'11" preschool teacher couldn't reach the folding table. If I hadn't worked that accident on Route 14, I wouldn't have pulled a stranger out of a burning Navigator, and that stranger wouldn't have spent 18 months looking for me. And I wouldn't be sitting on this porch right now at 44 years old, watching my daughter chase a butterfly across a yard that belongs to her. My ex-wife got remarried last fall to the widower from the parish. Sarah went to the wedding. I didn't. Sarah said it was a small thing, just the two families and the priest, and my ex-wife wore a pale blue dress and cried through her bows and the left side of her mouth didn't work right. But she looked peaceful for the first time in a long time. Sarah brought her a potted rosebush as a gift. My ex-wife hugged her and thanked her and asked after Margaret in the program, and me, in that order. And Sarah told her everything she could. On the drive home, Sarah asked me if I was okay. I told her I was. I told her I really was. I told her I'd spent enough of my life on that woman, and I wasn't going to spend any more of it, not even the kind you spend being angry. Sarah nodded. She put her hand on my knee. We drove the rest of the way home with the windows down and the radio playing something old, and I thought about my mother, and about the paramedic who'd winked at me over Mr. Relly, Kowalski's body in 1987, and about the long way home from a hotel room on Route 14, and I thought, finally, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and it had taken me 44 years to get there, and every single step had been worth it.